At 5:17 local time in the North Atlantic, the sea is calm, visibility is good, and flight operations continue as normal. Then, inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the SPY-1 radar picks up 5 new surface contacts at the far edge of the display. Multiple vessels bearing 041, range 22 nautical miles, making 24 knots and closing fast. No one shows any emotion, but across CIC, every station immediately shifts focus. 5 ships do not appear in a tight formation at high speed by chance. An identification query is sent. No reply. IFF comes back empty. At 5:18, the formation draws even tighter. The 5 vessels settle into a shallow wedge. Their bows aim straight toward the projected path of the carrier strike group. Their speed increases to 28 knots. This is not the pace of a routine patrol. This is a deliberate approach. On the carrier's bridge, the officer of the deck receives the update. Course unchanged. Speed unchanged. 25 knots on a steady heading. In situations like this, the first rule is simple. Never be the first to flinch. By 5:19, electronic support measures begin detecting emissions. At least 2 of the approaching ships are using low-power surface search radar. Moments later, a stronger signal appears. Narrow beam, higher gain. Possibly a fire control quality scan, the electronic warfare officer reports. Still, there is no radio contact. The 5 ships are now within 20 nautical miles. Ahead of the formation, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers from the strike group increase speed and shift their bearings, moving outward to widen the defensive screen. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser edges to port, extending radar coverage and creating overlapping fields of fire. No alarms sound, no announcement is made, but Condition 3 is set quietly. Critical stations are manned. The vertical launch system is powered and ready, though safeties remain in place. At 5:21, the picture sharpens. Hull profiles and emissions analysis begin to match. Probable Russian Federation naval combatants. Frigate-class signatures. 1 larger vessel, likely a destroyer. Range now 15 nautical miles. Up on the flight deck, 2 FA-18 Super Hornets are moved into launch position. Their loadouts are defensive. AIM-12, OAM-R, AAMs, and AIM-9X. Sidewinders. No strike package. Pure air cover. The order comes from primary flight control, calm and measured. Launch. Steam blasts from Catapult 2. The first Hornet is airborne within seconds, climbing hard through 5,000 feet. The second follows less than half a minute later. Neither switches to active radar. Both remain passive, listening, watching, documenting. At 5:23, the Russian group accelerates again, now 30 knots, full speed. Their wakes carve long white lines across the dark Atlantic. Then the geometry changes. Instead of continuing on a straight intercept, the outer ships begin drifting apart, one to port, one to starboard, turning the approach into a shallow arc. That is not random drift, that is intentional positioning. Closest point of approach is recalculated. CPA now 2.88 nautical miles and shrinking. At that distance, even a small steering mistake can become dangerous. A deliberate turn could be read as an attempt to force a collision. Inside CIC, the Aegis combat system tracks every vessel with exacting precision. Intercept timelines populate the screens in green numbers. No one has fired a shot, but every solution is in place. At 5:25, one of the Russian ships emits another brief radar spike, stronger than before. 3 seconds, then gone. The electronic warfare officer looks up. That was closer. No one needs to say more. On the bridge, the captain studies the tactical display without changing his tone. Maintain course. Maintain speed. Log everything. The carrier does not move offline. The message is unmistakable. This transit is legal, deliberate, and not open to intimidation. Above, the 2 Super Hornets level off at 20,000 feet, circling over the widening arc of steel below. Their sensor pods zoom in, capturing hull numbers, deck activity, gun positions. Infrared imagery shows heat signatures from forward stations on at least 2 ships. Not active, but not cold either. At 5:27, the range falls below 9 nautical miles. The Russian formation now stretches nearly 4 miles across the horizon. The central destroyer keeps the most aggressive track, bow pointed directly at the carrier's future position. Wake turbulence grows, speed remains at 30 knots. At 5:28, the strike group tightens its posture again. Phalanx CIWS mounts shift from passive standby to tracking ready mode. The 5-inch guns stay trained fore and aft, but their alignment changes just enough to be noticed through long-range optics. A quiet signal, clearly intended to be seen. Aegis updates the projections. CPA now 1.9 nautical miles. This is no longer ordinary proximity, this is pressure. Still no radio call from the Russian formation. No warning, no explanation. Only 5 warships closing fast and shaping their movement around an American aircraft carrier in international waters. At 5:29, every display in CIC shows the same converging lines. Every officer in the room understands how thin the margin has become. One sustained radar lock, one abrupt turn of the helm, one misunderstood move, and this quiet Atlantic morning could change in an instant. The range keeps dropping, 6 nautical miles. 5. The formation keeps coming, and neither side gives ground. At 5:31 local time, with the range at 5 nautical miles, the picture changes again. The 5 Russian warships stop holding a simple intercept line and begin opening outward. 2 peel gradually to port, 2 to starboard, while the central destroyer continues straight toward the carrier's bow. The move is subtle, controlled, and impossible to misread. Inside CIC, bearing lines stretch across the tactical display like tightening cables. They're spreading, a surface tracking officer notes. Aegis recalculates. CPA falls once more, now 1.4 nautical miles. At this distance, there is no room left for error. A commercial vessel would alter course. A smaller warship might reduce speed. The carrier does neither. 25 knots, steady heading. The strike group responds by compressing its formation. The lead destroyer shifts half a mile closer to the carrier's projected path, forming a visible barrier. The cruiser moves 2 degrees starboard, expanding radar overlap and ensuring no blind sectors open between ships. Still no sirens. Still no dramatic call to action. Just quiet motion, measured adjustments, and total control. At 5:32, the starboard-most Russian ship accelerates again, now 32 knots, full speed. White water explodes behind it as it drives into the turn, cutting diagonally toward the carrier's projected route. This is no longer simple shadowing. This is maneuvering designed to apply pressure. The bridge-to-bridge radio is opened. Russian naval vessels operating bearing 041. This is a United States warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. Your current maneuvers are unsafe. Recommend alter course immediately. Silence. The central Russian destroyer keeps coming. Through long-range optics, deck crews are visible. Helmets on, personnel stationed near the forward gun mounts. The systems are not aimed, but they are far from inactive. At 5:33, electronic support measures spike once more. A narrow beam radar sweep crosses the carrier's signature, this time longer, 5 full seconds before it disappears. Possible fire control quality scan. The electronic warfare officer confirms inside CIC. No one raises their voice. They do not need to. In the background, Aegis elevates priority. Engagement timelines for SM-2 interceptors finalize. Phalanx mounts automatically track each contact. Above them, the Super Hornets descend to 12,000 feet. Still passive, still silent, but now much closer. Their sensor pods zoom in tighter, recording everything in sharp detail. Bridge windows, radar arrays, hull numbers, deck posture, every movement preserved frame by frame. If you want, I can continue in the same style and rewrite the rest of the text too. At 5:34, the Russian ship on the port flank mirrors the move from starboard, adding speed and sliding wider to expand the arc. The pattern is now unmistakable. The carrier sits at the center of a developing semicircle. Range, 3 nautical miles. CPA 1.1. If the Russian ship on the starboard side holds its course, it will pass less than a mile ahead of the carrier's bow. At 25 knots, that leaves almost no time to react. On the bridge, the captain studies the surface plot and gives the order without pause. Maintain course. No hesitation. If the carrier turns first, the story changes. At 5:35, the starboard Russian destroyer fully commits. Its bow cuts across the carrier's projected track, wake rising hard against the hull as it holds 32 knots. Inside CIC, bearing lines pull together sharply. CPA drops again, now 0.9 nautical miles under a mile. At that distance, collision avoidance margins become dangerously thin. One sudden rudder input from either side could bring steel into contact. Above, one Super Hornet descends to 5,000 feet and places itself directly between the starboard Russian vessel and the carrier's bow line. Not hostile, not illuminating with radar. Just there. A message delivered through presence, speed, and the sound of jet engines. Below, the carrier stays on heading. The central Russian destroyer continues pressing straight in. For the next 30 seconds, the geometry tightens further. Another radar spike flashes, stronger this time. Inside CIC, a targeting alert flickers. Not a full lock, but close enough to sharpen every glance in the room. Vertical launch cells remain armed. Safeties stay engaged. Phalanx mounts shift by fractions, their tracking arcs quietly settling over the approaching ships. No one fires. Not yet. At 5:37, the tension reaches its highest point. 5 Russian warships. 1 American carrier. Less than a mile separating hulls, momentum, and intent. The starboard Russian ship continues its crossing move. The carrier's bow closes quickly. 25 knots against 32. More than 50 knots of combined closure in tactical terms. Inside CIC, every timer is ready. One bad call, one misunderstood signal, and the Atlantic morning would change in an instant. Then the Central Russian destroyer slows. 30 knots? 25? 22? The shift is small but decisive. The starboard ship relaxes its crossing angle. The portside vessels begin drifting outward by a few degrees. The semicircle starts to loosen. Radar emissions drop in strength. The narrow beam scan disappears altogether. Range begins to open. 1.2 nautical miles, then 1.5, then 2. Inside CIC, no one celebrates, but everyone sees it. They're easing off. The carrier never altered course, never reduced speed, never gave ground. At 5:39, the 5 Russian ships settle into a parallel shadowing formation. Still close. Still clearly present. But no longer trying to wrap around the strike group. The geometry has changed. The most dangerous moment has passed. For now. At 5:41 local time, the range has widened to 2 nautical miles and continues to grow. The semicircle is gone, but the formation remains intact. The 5 Russian warships now run nearly parallel to the carrier strike group, offset to port and starboard, holding position just beyond immediate collision range. Close shadowing, deliberate, controlled. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one relaxes. Aegis continues tracking all 5 ships, with firing solutions still active in the background. Engagement envelopes remain valid. Target priorities refresh every second. The crisis is not over. It has simply changed shape. At 5:42, electronic support measures detect a new emission. Stronger, focused. A fire control radar spike lasting 6 seconds. Longer than before. Long enough to confirm deliberate targeting behavior. On the tactical display, a thin red arc briefly appears over the track of the Central Russian destroyer. It is not a launch, not yet. But it is a test of the line. The captain's voice remains steady. Confirm source. Central contact bearing 040. Above, the Super Hornets pivot slightly, holding 8,000 feet while tightening lateral spacing to preserve visual control. Their sensors keep recording. No active radar, no weapons queue, just measured presence. At 5:43, one of the Russian frigates on the port side makes a subtle 3-degree turn inward. CPA drops again to 1.3 nautical miles. Not as close as before, but clearly intentional. The pressure begins to build again. On the carrier's forward deck, the 5-inch gun mount shifts by a fraction. Mechanical, deliberate, visible through long-range optics. Not aimed directly, but aligned enough to make the point. Phalanx mounts remain in tracking posture. Their white domes turn slightly as each Russian ship passes through engagement arcs. Inside CIC, the tension compresses into silence. Every operator understands what matters now. If that radar spike holds, if it shifts from search to lock, the response window shrinks to only seconds. At 5:44, the Central Russian destroyer increases speed again, from 22 knots to 28. Its wake brightens against the cold Atlantic. The parallel formation begins drifting inward once more. This is the new flashpoint. Combined closure rates again push past 50 knots in relative movement across the tactical picture. The lead Super Hornet drops even lower, now at 4,000 feet, crossing directly over the Central Russian ship's projected line. Still passive, still silent. Its shadow moves across the Russian deck. Infrared imagery confirms personnel moving below. No weapons raised, but every eye is clearly up. At 5:45, the radar spike returns. 8 seconds. Long enough to register as a sustained targeting sweep. Inside CIC, a targeting tone pulses softly. Aegis automatically refines its solutions. SM2, intercept timelines appear in green numerals. Time to intercept estimates fall below 30 seconds if needed. Vertical launch cells remain armed. Safeties stay in place. The captain gives no new order. He waits. The line between pressure and escalation is razor thin. At 5:46, the Russian frigate on the port side accelerates, edging closer toward the cruiser, screening the carrier. The cruiser answers with a 2-degree move outward, preserving spacing without yielding position. Neither side turns away. Neither side acts first. For 15 seconds, the Atlantic seems to stop breathing. Radar emissions from the Central Russian destroyer remain elevated. Everyone in CIC knows exactly what that means. This is not an accidental sweep. This is a test of nerve. The Super Hornet wingman tightens its orbit, visible from every Russian deck. 2 American fighters above, 5 Russian warships below. Steel, speed, and silence layered across the same patch of ocean. At 5:47, something changes. The radar spike flickers, weakens, disappears. The Central Russian destroyer slows again, 28 knots to 23. Its bow shifts outward by a single degree. Small but measurable. The portside frigate eases out of its inward drift. The geometry begins to open once more. CPA rises, 1.8 nautical miles, then 2.2. The cruiser holds course. The carrier never moves offline. At 5:48, the Russian formation settles into a clean parallel track, offset to port and starboard, no longer pressing inward. Radar emissions fall back to low-power surface search mode. No fire control quality scans, no sustained targeting behavior. The most dangerous moment passes without crossing the line. Inside CIC, the silence finally breaks. They backed off. No cheering, no release. Just recognition. Every second of the previous 6 minutes has been captured. Radar signatures, maneuver geometry, emission strength, deck posture, high intelligence value, escalation avoided. At 5:49, the range opens beyond 3 nautical miles. The 5 Russian warships remain visible, running parallel at moderate speed. Close enough to make their presence clear, far enough to avoid immediate danger. The Super Hornets climb back to 12,000 feet and continue overwatch. The carrier strike group proceeds with its lawful transit at 25 knots, unchanged. The Atlantic grows quiet again, but inside CIC, everyone understands exactly what just happened. For nearly 6 minutes, the distance between shadowing and open conflict was measured in seconds, angles, and signal strength. One sustained lock, one premature move, one overcorrection at the helm, and the North Atlantic would have looked very different. Instead, both sides held the line barely. And in that narrow space between escalation and control, everything changed. At 5:50 local time, the range has opened to 3.5 nautical miles and continues to grow. The 5 Russian warships maintain their new parallel formation, spread wide along both flanks of the carrier strike group. They are no longer tightening the circle, no longer attempting to surround, but they remain close. Close enough that hull numbers are still visible through long-range optics. Close enough that the wake from their bows cuts sharp white lines across the Atlantic. Inside the Combat Information Center, nothing slows down. Aegis keeps full-spectrum tracking active. Every Russian ship remains inside engagement parameters. Firing solutions stay live and constantly updated. Vertical launch systems remain powered. Phalanx mounts hold their alignment. The pressure has eased, but no one trusts it yet. At 5:51, electronic support measures confirm the shift. Russian emissions have dropped back to standard surface search levels. No fire control quality signals. The first clear sign of de-escalation. The central Russian destroyer, previously the most aggressive, reduces speed again, from 23 knots down to 19. Its bow angles another 2 degrees outward. The geometry opens cleanly. CPA now projects beyond 4 nautical miles. That is no longer collision territory, that is controlled shadowing distance. On the carrier's bridge, the captain watches the tactical display in silence. No change in course, no change in speed. The carrier continues its transit exactly as before. At 5:52, one of the Russian frigates falls back slightly, sliding behind the central destroyer's line. The outer ships widen their spacing. They are no longer trying to bracket the carrier. The semicircle is gone. What remains is a loose parallel escort, visible intent, reduced pressure. Above, the Super Hornets climb to 15,000 feet, expanding their orbit while keeping sensors locked on the formation below. Their presence remains obvious from every deck. Infrared systems confirm no active weapon stations, no missile hatches open, no guns trained. At 5:53, the radio finally comes alive. A calm, accented voice breaks through. United States Naval Formation. This is Russian Federation Navy vessel conducting routine maritime operations in international waters. It is not an apology. It is not a concession, but it is contact. The reply from the cruiser is just as controlled. Russian naval vessels, United States Formation conducting lawful transit. Unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. Recommend continued safe separation. No escalation, no raised voices, just 2 powers acknowledging each other across open ocean. Inside CIC, analysts mark the moment. First Russian radio transmission at 5:53, 36 minutes after initial radar contact. That detail will matter later. At 5:54, the range extends beyond 5 nautical miles. The Russian ships match speed at roughly 18 knots, now trailing slightly behind the carrier's starboard quarter. Still shadowing, but no longer pressing. At 5:55, Condition 3 remains active, though internal readiness begins to settle. Safeties stay engaged. Engagement timelines remain valid, but no longer flashing urgent alerts. Phalanx mounts widen their scan arcs. Electronic warfare teams continue passive monitoring, logging every signal, frequencies, power levels, modulation patterns. The intelligence value is significant. On the flight deck, additional aircraft are positioned but not launched. The air wing holds at ready status, prepared but not escalating. At 5:57, the central Russian destroyer adjusts course slightly northward, about 5 degrees off the carrier's track. The other ships follow gradually. The separation line reestablishes itself. 6 nautical miles. 7. Inside CIC, the geometry stabilizes. The senior tactical officer exhales slowly. Not relief, just recalibration. No shots fired, no contact made, no weapons deployed. But for several minutes, the margin had been measured in seconds. The carrier never turned, never slowed, never gave up navigational control. That is what matters. At 6 o'clock, the Russian formation settles into a distant parallel track. No longer converging. The Atlantic looks calm again, sunlight reflecting off steel hulls moving along separate paths. Above, the Super Hornets widen their orbit and begin transitioning toward fuel checks. The strike group resumes a more routine posture, though every console remains alert, because events like this do not end when ships move apart. They continue in analysis, in reports, in quiet evaluations. For 33 minutes, 5 warships attempted to compress space around a U.S. carrier. For 33 minutes, that space held. No retreat, no escalation, just precision, discipline, and control. The shift was not dramatic. It came in small increments. A few degrees of rudder, a slight drop in speed, a radar signal fading. But at sea, those small changes mean everything. By the time the range stretches toward 8 nautical miles, one fact is clear. Pressure was applied, the boundary held, and no one crossed the final line. At 6:05, the distance reaches 9 nautical miles. The Russian ships remain visible on the horizon, smaller now, moving in a loose shadow pattern off the carrier's starboard side. No longer shaping, no longer pressing, just present. The ocean looks calm again. Inside CIC, nothing about the last 48 minutes feels routine. Every radar spike, every turn, every speed change is already being replayed and analyzed. At 6:06, the Super Hornets begin returning to the carrier. Fuel states checked, sensors still recording. Their role was deterrence, not engagement. They never switched to active radar, never moved beyond a defensive posture. But their presence changed the situation, and that is noted. Inside CIC, the timeline is reviewed step by step. 5:17, initial radar contact 5:23, acceleration to full speed 5:34, semicircle formation begins 5:42, sustained fire control radar, spike 5:47, speed reduction, and outward shift. The turning point is clear. The moment that radar signal held beyond 5 seconds. That was the threshold. If it had continued, if it had become a full lock, the timeline for response would have collapsed. Launch systems were ready, intercept windows calculated, defensive systems aligned. The response would not have been dramatic. It would have been immediate. At 6:08, Russian emissions dropped fully to baseline patrol levels. No targeting scans, no elevated signals. Their formation angles gradually northward, widening the gap to 12 nautical miles. Shadowing becomes distance. The Atlantic grows quiet again, but something has changed. On the bridge, the captain steps back from the display. The carrier never altered course, never reduced speed, never yielded control. That matters. Naval strength is not only measured in weapons or tonnage, it is measured in who holds position under pressure. At 6:10, flight operations resume at full pace. Another aircraft launches. Steam rises. Engines roar. From the outside, it looks routine. Inside CIC, data transfer is already underway. Emission libraries updated. Signal patterns cataloged. Radar behavior recorded in detail. In less than an hour, the Russian ships revealed more than they intended. Because this was not only about distance, it was a test of timing, of restraint, of whether the carrier would yield under pressure. It did not. By 6:12, the range exceeds 15 nautical miles. The 5 ships are now distant shapes against the horizon, no longer converging, no longer shaping anything, just fading into the background. There will be no immediate headlines, no instant footage. But both sides will document everything. Every angle, every signal, every decision. For several critical minutes, conditions hovered just below the line. One sustained lock, one misread move, one early action, and the Atlantic would have told a very different story. Instead, it showed control. The carrier strike group continues forward at 25 knots, unchanged, unmoved. The Russian formation turns gradually north, increasing distance to 20 nautical miles. By 6:15, the shadowing ends. Condition 3 is quietly relaxed. Systems return to standard readiness. Watch rotations normalize. But no one forgets what just happened. The boundary was tested. Space was compressed. The margin narrowed to seconds. And in that narrow space, something shifted. Both sides now carry new data, new insight, a clearer understanding of how the other reacts under pressure. The ocean is calm again, but the next encounter will not start from zero. It will start with memory. And at sea, memory can be just as powerful as any weapon. Because when 5 warships close in, and the carrier does not blink, the balance changes.